The Chesapeake Bay does not advertise its cruelties. It simply performs them quietly and without ceremony, the way large bodies of water have always handled the small matters of human and animal fate. On a gray November morning when the water was the color of old pewter and the horizon had disappeared into low cloud, Dion Hayes was running his crab boat 3 miles off the eastern shore of Maryland when his deckhand, a 23-year-old from Easton named Pete, pointed at something orange in the water and said, "Dion, what is that?" Dion reduced the throttle and the boat settled into its wake, and he looked at what Pete was pointing at. And for a long moment neither of them said anything, because what they were looking at was not what either of them had expected to be looking at on a Tuesday in November in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. It was a crab pot buoy, orange and white, standard issue, and something yellow was wrapped around it with the desperate, locked-in grip of something that had decided this was the last thing it was going to let go of, and it had made this decision some time ago, and it was still holding. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from tonight, and subscribe to this channel before we go further. Because what Dion Hayes pulled out of the Chesapeake Bay that Tuesday morning was not simply an animal that had nearly drowned. It was the beginning of an answer to a question he had been carrying for 11 years without believing an answer was possible. And the Chesapeake Bay, which does not advertise its cruelties, apparently also does not advertise the other thing it sometimes does, which is return what it owes. Dion Hayes was 50 years old and had the body of a man who had spent the first half of his life building something nearly indestructible and the second half maintaining what remained of it. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, with close-cropped gray-salted hair and dark, deep-set eyes that had the quality of having seen a great deal without allowing much of it to show in real time. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried economy of men who have learned to conserve energy because they have spent enough of it in situations where the reserves matter. He had grown up in Baltimore, in a row house neighborhood in Cherry Hill where the water was visible on clear days if you stood at the right angle on the right corner, and where the water meant something that had nothing to do with recreation. His father had worked the canning houses. His grandfather had worked the boats. The bay was in the family the way certain things are in families, not as a choice, but as an inheritance, a thing that had claimed them before they were old enough to consent. Dion had left at 18, not in rejection of the water, but in the way of young men who need to go somewhere large before they can understand the scale of where they came from. He had joined the Navy and discovered, to his own lasting surprise, that he was exceptionally good at it. He had become a Navy SEAL at 24 and had spent the next 18 years operating in environments where the water was not the Chesapeake, where the bay's flat gray benevolence was replaced by cold mountain rivers and harbor channels and the black water of coasts he was not permitted to name in any document. He had been good at the work and had survived it, and had left it at 42 with a body that still functioned and a memory that functioned too well, which was the particular imbalance that most operators carried home and rarely discussed. His son's name had been Marcus. He had been 7 weeks old when he died, and Dion had not been there. He had been in a country whose name he was not permitted to use, in the middle of an operation that could not be delayed, when his phone, carried against every protocol in a waterproof case in his kit bag, had received a message from his wife Renata that he did not read until the operation was complete, 6 hours later. In those same 6 hours, on the same day, in an alley in a village that also could not be named, Dion Hayes had pulled a child from a drainage channel where the water was 6 inches deep, and the child, a girl of perhaps 4, had been face down and had not been breathing. He had performed resuscitation, and the child had breathed and had cried and had eventually been returned to a woman who was almost certainly her mother, who looked at Dion with an expression he had carried for 11 years without finding a word for it. He had saved that child, and he had not known yet that he had lost his own. And when he read the message 6 hours later, the two facts arrived in his mind simultaneously, and they had never completely separated since. The doctors called it SIDS, which was a name for a thing that had no explanation, and the no explanation was the part that had stayed with Dion Hayes longest, the most unanswerable thing in a life that had contained a great many things he had needed to answer. He had held Marcus twice, both times before the deployment, and the weight of him, 7 pounds 11 ounces of new life, was something Dion still felt in his arms on certain mornings in a way that had not diminished with time but had simply become part of how his arms felt. He had come back to the eastern shore of Maryland 2 years after leaving the Navy, after Renata had gone and the Baltimore apartment had gone, and after a period of time in his sister's house in Annapolis that he did not discuss in detail. The eastern shore was where his grandfather had crewed, where the family's water knowledge had originated. And the work was available, and the work was honest, and it required every part of his body and brain simultaneously, which was the closest thing to peace he had located. He ran his own crab boat now, a 42-foot deadrise named Marcus James, the second name for himself and the first for his son. And he worked the water with the focused, methodical precision of a man who has transferred his operational training to a different kind of field and found, to his quiet relief, that it transferred well. Roy Satterfield had been crabbing these waters since 1972 and was 76 years old and had the sun and wind face of a man who has spent 6 decades arguing with weather, and he had accepted Dion into the loose, unspoken fraternity of Eastern Shore watermen with the particular form of acceptance that community practices, which is to say, he showed up when Dion's engine failed and did not make a production of it, and he drank coffee on Dion's dock when the morning was slow and did not require conversation. And one winter he had said to Dion, without prelude, that the bay took a lot, but it also gave back, and he had said it as a statement of fact about tides and crabbing, and Dion had heard something else in it, and neither of them had pursued it further, because that was not how this particular fraternity operated. The yellow Labrador had been in the water for an estimated 6 to 8 hours by the time Dion reached her, which was the estimate the veterinarian in Easton gave based on her body temperature and the condition of her paws. She was a female, approximately 2 years old, with a coat that had plastered flat against her body and paws, so waterlogged they had begun to soften at the pads. She weighed, when she could finally be weighed the following day, 61 pounds, which was on the light side for her frame. She had no identification, no collar mark, no microchip that any scanner in the county could find. The county animal control officer, who came out to Roy's dock, where Dion had temporarily housed her, looked at her carefully and said that a Labrador in that condition, in November, that far from shore, had almost certainly gone off a boat, and that the boat had either not noticed or had not circled back. And something about the way he said it told Dion that the officer had a theory about which of those two it was. She had not barked when Dion brought the boat alongside the buoy. She had looked at him with those dark amber eyes, and she had not let go of the buoy, which was the right decision, because letting go was exactly what a dog in that situation should not do, and either by instinct or by some more specific understanding, she had not done it. He had gotten his arms under her and lifted her over the gunwale, and she had weighed almost nothing, which was the terrifying part, and he had laid her on the deck, and she had looked up at him from the deck, the same way she had looked at him from the water, which was with a directness that had nothing of the usual canine flattery in it. Not grateful, not afraid, paying attention. He had called her Hazel, because of the color her eyes held when the light came through them at the right angle. The first 2 weeks Hazel was in Dion's house. She behaved less like a dog recovering from a near drowning and more like an inspector completing an assessment. She moved through every room with a careful, thorough attention of something that needed to understand its environment before it could decide what to do in it. She had no destructive impulse, no anxiety barking, no apparent trauma response that Dion could identify. She ate steadily and slept deeply and followed Dion from room to room during his waking hours with the patient, professional attention of a creature that has been assigned a post and takes the assignment seriously. On the 4th night, she slept on the floor beside his bed, which he had not invited and did not discourage, and on the 7th night she had moved in the night to lie against the wall on the side of the bed that had been empty since Renata left. And Dion woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark and felt her breathing in the room and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and the breathing was there, and it was enough for right now, and right now was what was available. Roy came by on the 10th day, which was the day Hazel was cleared by the Easton veterinarian as fully recovered, and he stood on the porch and looked at her sitting beside Dion with the mild interest of a man who takes dogs seriously but does not sentimentalize them. "That's a retriever," he said, "built for water." Dion said he knew. Roy looked at him over the coffee mug. "She go back in?" Dion said she hadn't had any aversion response to the hose when he bathed her. Roy nodded and said nothing more. which was his way of saying that this was important information and that the implications were clear, and that he would leave Dion to arrive at them on his own schedule. That was Roy's particular form of respect, and Dion had come to depend on it. He had not allowed himself to think about Marcus directly for several years. This was not repression in the clinical sense. It was more like the bay itself. When there is no wind, the surface was still. But what was beneath the surface had not stopped moving. The grief was there, and it was real, and he had never pretended otherwise. He had simply found that direct engagement with it produced a kind of paralysis that indirect engagement did not, and so he had arranged his life around the indirect engagement. The crab boat was named for his son. He kept a photograph in the cabin of the boat, above the chart table, a hospital photograph, the only one that existed. He did not look at it directly. He knew where it was. On some mornings, the peripheral awareness of it was the most he could manage, and on some mornings it was the thing that made him get the boat out of the slip. He had not talked about Marcus to anyone on the eastern shore. Roy knew that something had happened, which was the kind of knowledge that watermen develop about each other through proximity and time rather than through disclosure. And he had done what he always did with such knowledge, which was to hold it without displaying it. The rehook came on a Saturday in June, when the bay had settled into the long, warm flatness of summer, and the tourist boats were out in numbers that the watermen regarded with the resigned tolerance of professionals sharing their workplace. With amateurs, a charter sailing catamaran with 6 passengers had anchored in a cove 3 miles from Dion's usual water, and one of the passengers, a man from outside Philadelphia whose name Dion later learned was Greg Whitfield, had allowed his 8-year-old daughter to lean too far over the stern rail to look at something in the water, and she had gone over in her life vest, which the charter required but did not fit the way it should have, had come off in the water, and by the time anyone on board realized she was gone, she was 10 feet from the catamaran, and moving away from it in a current that the guests had not known was there. Dion was not close. He was on the other side of a point of land and could not see the catamaran. What he heard was the shout, and in this he was lucky, because the shout from the boat was loud enough, and the water was still enough, and the point of land provided enough acoustic reflection that it carried. He heard it, and his engine was already at idle, and his hand was on the throttle before the second shout, and he swung the Marcus James around the point at a speed that Roy Satterfield, watching from his own boat 200 yards away, later described as not the speed a crab boat moves, but the speed something else moves when something specific is happening. Hazel had been on the bow, which was where she preferred to be when the boat was moving, and when they came around the point, and Dion saw the catamaran and the water around it, and the small shape in the water 20 feet from the boat and moving. Hazel had already left the bow. She went off the starboard rail at full run and hit the water clean, the way a retriever hits water, not falling but entering. And Dion had the boat throttled back and was reaching for the throw ring, but Hazel was already moving. She covered the distance in a time that Dion later said he could not accurately measure because he had stopped being able to separate time into its normal units. She reached the girl, and the girl grabbed her, and Hazel turned back toward the boat, swimming with the powered, efficient stroke of an animal that had been built for exactly this, and that had apparently decided, in the 2 seconds between seeing the situation and entering the water, that this was what she was for. Dion had the stern ladder down and was in the water himself before they reached the boat, and he took the girl from Hazel's back and handed her up to the ladder, and she was coughing and terrified and entirely alive. And Hazel climbed the stern ladder herself with the deliberate composure of a dog that has completed an assignment and is returning to its post. The girl's name was Emma. She was 8 years old. Her father was on the catamaran screaming her name with a quality of screaming that Dion recognized from a specific kind of experience, which was the sound a person makes when they have understood what was about to happen and cannot believe that it did not. Dion sat on the stern of the Marcus James while the charter boat's captain called the Coast Guard, and the passengers attended to Emma, who was wrapped in everything dry that the catamaran offered. Hazel lay beside Dion on the stern with her wet coat already beginning to dry in the June sun. Dion put his hand on her back and she did not move, and he sat there with his hand on her back and he thought about a drainage channel in a village he could not name, and about a 4-year-old girl with a face he could still see clearly, and about a message he had read 6 hours after it was sent, and about 7 pounds 11 ounces and what that weighs, and what it continues to weigh. He was not crying. He was not performing anything. He was sitting on the stern of a boat named Marcus James with a yellow Labrador retriever that had gone into the Chesapeake Bay twice for reasons that were in both cases the same reason, and he was understanding, for the first time in 11 years, that the two things he had never been able to put in the same sentence were the same sentence, and that the sentence was, some things you save and some things you lose, and neither of those facts cancels the other. Roy came alongside in his own boat 20 minutes later and looked at the situation and at Dion's face and at Hazel, and said only, "She know what she's for." Dion said yes. Roy said he'd buy the first round at the landing. Dion said that was the first thing Roy had ever offered to pay for. Roy said exceptional circumstances and pulled away, and Dion almost laughed, which was the closest he had come to it in longer than he wanted to calculate. Emma Whitfield's parents sent a letter 2 weeks later, a handwritten letter, not an email, which Dion noted and respected. In it, Greg Whitfield wrote that he had been trying to find the right words since Saturday and had not found them yet, but was sending the letter anyway, because some things should be said even when they are not yet adequate. He said that Emma had asked every day about the dog and had described her as the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, which was a very 8-year-old way of describing a wet yellow Labrador retriever, and Dion had folded the letter and put it in the chart table of the Marcus James next to the photograph, and for the first time in 11 years, those two things were in the same place, and he knew where they both were and could look at them at the same time. He did not look at them every day. Some days the bay was enough, and the work, and Roy's presence on the water, and Hazel on the bow reading the wind with her nose the way retrievers read everything, with their entire body turned toward it. But the letter was there, and the photograph was there, and they were no longer in different rooms of his interior life, which was a change so structural and so complete that he had no idea how to describe it to anyone who had not needed the same change, and so he had not tried. Some things the bay takes. And on a Tuesday in November, in the middle of gray water with no land visible on any horizon, Dion Hayes had learned that some things it also gives back, not in the form you lost them, not as a replacement, not as an explanation, but as a continuation, the next sentence in a story that you had believed was finished, told in the specific vocabulary of cold water and amber eyes, and the locked grip of something that has decided it is not done yet. If this story found you tonight, share it with someone who is carrying a loss they have not been able to put in the same sentence as anything else. Tell us in the comments which moment reached you most and which city you are watching from. And if you can, support a water rescue animal program or a child water safety organization near you. Because both of those things matter, and both of them are underfunded, and both of them do the work that prevents the moments that require the rest of this. Subscribe to this channel and we will keep finding these stories.